شلام أرخن مخبي خاجة خيتا دخ Gershok al-Khabar course at Shimoila, the Assyrian Book Club on AGN, the Assyrian Global Network, which is sponsored by Nabi Fry Fund for Culture, Shenatitun. This evening, we are going to be speaking with a woman by the name of Arda Clark, and the book that we are referring to is called Bloodied and Unbowed. So Arda is here with us today. We're very excited to speak with her about the book that relates to her family of a few generations going back. Is that correct, Arda?
Yes. Hello.
Good evening.
Good evening. This book was written by my grandmother, by my maternal grandmother. It was published in 1965. It was written in Armenian. And so this particular edition is the translation into English, and this came out in 2019, or rather the end of 2018.
Yes, thank you. And so you are the author, which is Alice Nazarian. Is that correct? Is that correct pronunciation?
Yes,
and
that is correct.
She is your maternal grandmother.
That is correct. My mom's mom. Uh-huh.
Your mom's mom. Okay, yes. So this book is called Bloodied and Unbowed. It's a memoir of the Ashur and Arsha Louis Yosef family. And it was translated by a gentleman by the name of Ishkhan Jinbashian. Would that be a correct pronunciation?
Yes, that is correct. Ishkhan Jinbashian. Uh-huh.
Yes, and tell us how you are involved in this book.
Okay, so this book really came about because my uncle, who is my maternal uncle, so the son of Alice, he really wanted to get this translated into English because most of the family now lives either in the US or Canada or, elsewhere around the world, some in Australia, some in France. And so many of them speak English. Many of them no longer, even if they speak Armenian or understand it, they don't know how to read it. So he wanted the book translated into English for the family. And he basically hired a translator, Ishkhan Jimbashian, who's an excellent translator. He did a really fantastic job translating the book. And then subsequently, talking to my uncle, we realized that the information, there's a section of genealogy in the book, and all of that ended in 1965. So we felt like, okay, we need to bring this up to date. So another cousin of mine, his name is Haig Boyajian, he and I began interviewing people, trying to get information about where various members of the family were. So that part was added. And, I was still sort of not quite comfortable with the book. It just didn't seem to come together well. And I was looking up information about Ashur Yusuf, and I came across a professor, Roger Williams University. He teaches history there. He's an Assyrian man by the name of Sargon George Donabed. And I thought, wow, this name, my grandmother had a sibling named Sargon. She had a sibling named George. She had an uncle named Donabed. So it was like all these Assyrian names. And so, I looked him up a little bit, and then I emailed him just out of curiosity, because I had seen something of his where he had mentioned Ashur Yusuf. And so he put me in touch with Thomas. He has two last names. I'm not sure which he uses now. I know him as Thomas Isik, or maybe Beth Advala is his other last name. But he is in Sweden, and he has this archive called the Modern Assyrian Research Archive. And he was so kind to share with me a lot of documents that he had in his archives. And it was interesting because he had many of them that were in Armenian. And of course, he doesn't speak, or he doesn't read Armenian. And so, so I had these scans of documents that, I worked on, and also some actually Ishkan translated as well. So it was kind of a really interesting project how it came about. Uh, my grandmother had no idea that her father's writings still existed anywhere. So that was quite a surprise to us, to see that a lot of
Mm.
these things that we thought were lost
Right.
forever, were actually there.
Right. A lot of handwritten too. I think your
Yes,
great grandfather did a lot of
yes,
Assyrian in his own handwriting as well. So it wasn't just writing that was translated, it was actually handwritten. Beautiful handwriting as well.
right. Yeah, it's in Syriac
Mhm.
letters, and a lot of it is Turkish. Uh, yeah, so it's yeah. I mean, I think there's about 4 years worth of those the journal that my great grandfather was writing, editing. I'm not really sure what the content of it is, but I just
Mhm.
know it does still exist.
Yeah, but just preserving that
Yes, yes,
what a treasure to have that kind of that kind of
absolutely.
memory. Yeah, especially the handwriting. That's very personal.
Yes, absolutely.
So tell us about the setting of the book, Asher Louise and Ashur, going back to the late 1800s, and the setting of the book, and how their story came about.
Yeah, let's see, they were born, um, in I think my great grandfather was born in 1858. At least that's what some of the records show.
Mhm.
I think he may have been born as maybe in 1863, because based on what my grandmother says, the year he married was 1895. He was 32, so he would have been born 1863. But elsewhere, it says he was born 1858. And my great grandmother rather, she was born in 1876. Uh, Ashur was a professor at Euphrates College. They were called professors, but they weren't college professors, more like probably the equivalent of high school. He taught Armenian language, linguistics, some religion, calligraphy, I understand. And Ashalus was a student there. I don't know that he was her direct teacher. I just know that he was a teacher there, she was a student there, and when she graduated in 1895, they got married.
Hmm. And
Mhm.
that's how the story begins. So,
Yes,
and then they get married, and then they have six children.
correct.
And
Yeah, 6 who survived. There were a total of 9 children, 3 died in infancy, and 6 survived.
yes, and then of course later the tragedy that befalls the family with Asha Louise's sons, etc. It's a tragic story and a tragic time. But I want to talk about her trials and how she managed to get through those trials and those hardships. She was a very, very resilient woman.
Yes, definitely. I mean, there's the book begins with, shortly after they get married, during the Hamidian massacres. Her husband is about to be murdered, and she begs for his life, and his life is spared. That's in 1895. But in 1915, Ashur is arrested and taken away, and subsequently killed. Um, and so Aisha is left with the 6 children. And so, this is taking place obviously during the genocide. We have 1.5 million people who perished, Armenians, Assyrians, Greeks. So it's happening in that time period where, uh, women didn't work in those days. And it's a time of famine, it's a time of disease, it's a time of exile. So, under very extraordinarily awful circumstances, she is faced with raising her children, taking care of her
Yeah,
children. Yeah.
right. Finding work and feeding them and protecting them and ensuring their safety. And there's so much detailed information in the book. It's fascinating to see her resilience and how she tried so hard to take care of not just her own children, but the children that belonged in the neighborhood. Not just children, adults as well. She was into taking care of everyone and protecting everyone, even though she was so grief-stricken by her own hardships. But that did not faze her, and that didn't allow her to stop. And she just continued her fight.
Correct. Yeah, she knew a gentleman named Henry Riggs, who was an American missionary, and he was, I believe, he was president of Euphrates College for a while. And also, there was an organization called the Near East Relief. And so Mr. Riggs was familiar with my great-grandmother, and he had asked her to help with these orphanages. And so, yeah, that's what she did for basically the rest of her life. She taught in school. She, yeah, that's what she did. She took care of, her own orphans as well as the orphans of others. Yeah.
Exactly. Her own orphans as well as the orphans of others. And then eventually the orphans of her own son, which became her grandchildren, because of the tragedy of her son that had died in a fire, and then her daughter-in-law in a different fire. Horrific. Yes. But yes, and she stayed strong for those that were around her, and to keep them alive and happy and healthy. And she worked. She worked in schools and orphanages and had a great repertoire amongst other educators. And she was asked to work at different schools, and she was in demand basically for her qualifications.
Right.
Wonderful story. So going back to you and your involvement in this book, what motivated you to be involved other than wanting to preserve your family's story? What motivated you to be involved? And we talked about who had actually confronted you to get this going, but what about you personally?
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, I guess I shared my uncle's desire to have the story, translated into English. I am married to an American man. My children also don't read, or actually they don't speak Armenian, so I wanted them to know the story as well. So that was my personal involvement. And my uncle has always pushed me to write, so I was interested in the project on that level too, of putting it all together.
Yeah, and having it come to fruition, I guess that would have been an exciting time to see it all come together.
Yes, absolutely.
A lot of hard work, a lot of dedication, patience is required, and waiting for things to come through.
Oh yeah, it took quite a while. I know my uncle and I and my cousin Haiga mentioned we started talking, I think, in September of 2016, and then by the time the book came out in November of 2018, so it took a little over 2 years total. Not all of that time obviously was spent working. There was a lot of time when we had sent out emails to family members asking information. We're waiting to get information back, that kind of thing. But things really sort of heated up, I think, in February of 2018 when I did email Professor Donabed, and then he introduced me to Tomas and so on. And then, so basically February through November of 2018, so that 9-month period, the book, suddenly came together. A lot of pieces sort of fell into place and it came together.
Yeah, that would have been a joyful time.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, no doubt. One thing I noticed, a common theme throughout the book with your great-great-grandmother, Asha Louise, was she relied on God more than she did anything else, I would say. There is a common theme for her constantly making comments of, without God, this wouldn't happen. Even in her hardship, she was still praising and worshiping. And I just have a quote here that I thought was a nice one to read, of many, many, many. every trial, she was always referring. She would say, "Yet God is merciful to those who kneel before Him with absolute faith." So, and this was a common thread throughout her journey. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think she was a woman of strong faith.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, she definitely, leaned on her faith to get her through. And I think that also, I think another theme, and I did find, let me, I made a note, let me look it up. This is something actually that not Ashley says, but my grandmother says, but I think
Mm-hmm.
it's a theme. And she says, it is very much true that pain and suffering can shape character. So I think on
Yeah.
the one hand, you have a reliance of God, a reliance on faith, but also recognizing that, all of the trials and tribulations of life can shape your character
Mm-hmm.
if you choose to use it to shape
Yes,
your
and
character.
make you stronger rather
Yes.
than focusing on what has happened, but focused on what you have right now. And I think that's what Usher always did. She focused on what she had, didn't focus on what she had lost.
Yeah.
Very tragic as it is, but she didn't do that.
Yeah. I mean, elsewhere, my grandmother also says that she was definitely a woman who she was in control of her feelings. Not that
Mm,
not that she didn't feel deeply, but that she
of
was
course.
able to sort of transcend her feelings,
Mhm.
uh, to feel the tragedy, to feel the sadness, and simultaneously recognize that she can't just stay in the sadness, but,
Mhm.
move on from there. Yeah.
And she couldn't change the circumstance either.
Correct.
So she's obviously a very strong woman
Yeah.
mentally as well and
Yes.
emotionally. She was able to
Right.
control her emotions. That's what it sounded like to me also. Since you're
Mm.
talking about your grandmother, the late Alice, tell us a little bit about her. What are your memories of her, the author of the book?
Yeah. I was born in Aleppo, and Aleppo, Syria, and my grandparents lived in Aleppo, Syria at the time. So when she died, I was 20 years old. In fact, I last saw her on my birthday, the day I turned 20, and she died 4 days later. So I did
Mm,
know her, quite well for 20 years.
mhm,
She was a very charismatic person. Uh, she was the kind of person who walked into a room and you couldn't miss her. And I know when I was younger, when I was little, I always thought of her as a very tall person. And then later, I realized, no, she really wasn't tall, but it was just the way she carried herself. She had a kind of a regal bearing and a very charismatic person.
mhm,
Highly intelligent, but very affectionate too. With her grandkids. Very encouraging, loving person. Uh, kind of. I don't know that I would say eccentric, but she, like she had a chest at home in which she kept costumes. And so like when we
mm,
would go to her house, like we could put costumes on. And she loved to write little plays and skits, and she wrote out, like she would talk about, uh, she would come up with different games, I should say, and then she would
mm.
record them. So like in the future we could play the same game. She was a very inventive sort of person. Very
Yeah,
creative.
well, she was involved in theater when she was a teenager, and I think
Yes.
that's
Yes.
where your grandpa comes into the story.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah. And both my grandmother and great grandmother, they were yeah, involved with the theater. I mean, really any kind of art. I think they were interested in
Mhm.
writing,
Yeah.
theater.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, it's
Uh-huh.
wonderful how they were able to explore that and allow that to happen back in those days because it's not something that we hear much about. It's something that's more available, and people are just more involved in the theater and the arts these days.
Hmm.
But yeah, I'm just so glad that she was able to explore that side of her. And then her love story, I could tell she's charismatic actually through her writings and telling of her story about how she met your grandpa. and how she was trying so hard not to tell her mom because she knew what her mom would say.
Right, right,
Such a
right.
beautiful story. It's a beautiful love story, actually. And tell us did Grandma tell you any stories directly, or is it just from your readings about that story?
You know, she would tell some of the stories. You know, when the book did come out, you know, I was 9, and in fact, I have the book here in Armenian. This
Oh,
is
wow.
this is a copy of the book, and she had inscribed it to me. Uh,
Uh-huh.
so
Oh.
yeah, I would have been 9 years old. So I'm sure a lot of it, you know, a lot of it I didn't quite understand, but uh, many of the stories, yeah, we had heard growing up. You know, certainly about
Mhm.
her father's murder, about her brother dying in the fire, his wife also, her
Mhm.
brother's wife also dying tragically in the fire. Many of the stories we had heard. Uh,
Mhm.
yeah. Mhm.
You had heard directly from your grandmother?
Yes. Uh-huh.
I see. I see.
Yeah.
And then talking about your grandpa,
Mhm.
when did he pass away? Before
So
grandma or after Alice, the late Alice?
no, it was he lived another 15 years. So my grandmother
Mm.
died in 1976,
Hmm.
and he died in 1991.
Oh,
So
wow. So you have some
he lived on,
memories there still.
yeah, he lived on another 15 years, and he was extremely devoted to her. I mean,
I know.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's really telling the story. It really tells that he was adamant he wasn't going to let her go, and he was determined, and he
Yeah.
wanted her to wait for him. And such a beautiful love story.
Yeah, you know, he was a very kind man. He wasn't
Mm-hmm.
particularly talkative. He wasn't, you know, necessarily always demonstrative, but really such a generous and good person.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and their love for one another, I mean, just it was obvious, and the way they loved their kids, the way their kids loved one another, very unusual. I think compared to a lot of other families, very unusual.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
And he was a hardworking man too.
Yes.
He
Yeah,
really,
he
hmm
was. And
go ahead.
for many years, I mean, certainly when I knew him, he was a farmer, and the farm that I don't know if he owned it or just worked it, I'm not really sure, but it was probably 6, 7 hours away from Aleppo. So he would
Hmm.
drive uh, to the farm, and so he would be gone sometimes for, you know, a couple of weeks or whatever, and then come back. Yeah, but yeah,
Right.
definitely
Yeah,
hardworking man. Uh-huh.
yeah. And then where did he pass?
In
In
Los
where did he?
Angeles, they
In
both
Los
they both
Angeles.
they both died in Los Angeles. Uh-huh.
I see. So you obviously were able to spend some more time with your grandpa. You're in that area, correct?
Yes, yeah. So, like I said, I was born in Aleppo. I was born in 1956, and my grandparents, so Alice and Nazar, they came to the U.S. in 1967, and then my family, my parents, my siblings, and I, moved here in '69. So there was that 2-year gap where we didn't see them, but from '67 forward, you know, we were here. So yeah.
Hmm. So going back to Alice and Nazar's wedding, and your great grandmother, Asha
Uh-huh.
Louise, she had written commandments. That was
Right.
her gift to her daughter for their wedding. I thought this was so special. List of commandments of what she should do as a wife, and then the fascinating one of the ones that I enjoyed the most was number 10, and I'm going to read it now.
Okay.
It says,
Okay.
this was her commandment to her. Number 10, get out of bed before your husband does, and comb your hair, put on a nice dress, and wake him up with a smile to offer him coffee, to enjoy a happy moment together. After he leaves the house, a wonderful image of you will remain etched in his memory, and at the sight of women along his way, he will deem you superior to them all. And that's
Mhm.
one of her many commandments. I thought that was so precious. What a precious gift to write these commandments.
Yeah.
There was 12 of them, and she had
Right.
written them to her daughter. I thought that was so
Right.
precious. My late father used to say that to my mother, so
Yeah.
it reminded me of
Yeah.
them.
Yeah,
So
and
do you have any?
some of them are, kind of old-fashioned and sort
Of
of, you
course.
can say, products of the patriarchy and all that. But some of the commandments I find very wise.
Right.
I mean, there's one where she says, like if your husband, does something that you don't like or you don't approve of, don't say anything to him then, but then when he does something that you do like, make sure you praise him then. And sort of like, it's a current thing of you catch your kids, right, being good,
Yeah.
and you don't
That's
punish them, but you catch
right.
them when they're being good. Yeah, and I thought, wow, that's a very modern kind of idea that
Yes,
she
and
had
it's
even back then.
valuable.
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah,
Valuable. Very
yeah,
valuable.
yeah.
Very valuable information. So let's talk about um, we talked about, sorry, grandma Alice and your grandpa Nazar. We're just going to head back to Arsha Lewis's story and her husband, how he was
Hmm.
taken by the Turkish and never to be found again, believed to be was martyred.
Right,
Mr. Ashur Yosef was martyred by the Turkish, and the community was heartbroken because of the impact that it had on both the Assyrian and the Armenian community. He was a very had a huge impact on the community. That all the letters of grief, people writing heartbroken.
right.
My heart will never be the same again. So tell us about the impact that your great grandfather Ashur Yosef had on the Assyrian and the Armenian community.
Okay, so when Ashur Yusuf was murdered, my grandmother was 6 years old. So she had, very minimal memory of her father. So whatever she wrote about in the book, either came from perhaps her mother or just other older people. So in the book, what my grandmother primarily used was a little booklet that was published, I think it was 1919, by a group called the Assyrian Five. And
Mm,
in that little booklet were a number of uh, kind of an obituary, and then also some students of Ashur Yusuf or people who knew him well, who talked about their impressions of him. And he was an educator. He
mhm.
was a writer. He was an editor. He was an intellectual, and
Yeah.
really that was why he was arrested. He was rounded up like all the other uh, Armenian as well as Assyrian, uh, leaders of the community because
Mm.
of their influence on the people. So I think that's one aspect of it, and the other aspect of it is that uh, Ashur Yusuf was actually an Armenian speaking man. He knew Armenian quite well. He taught Armenian. And he also knew Turkish and he had learned English. He didn't actually learn Assyrian or the Syriac alphabet until later, really like about 5 years before he died. And he was highly interested in what made the Assyrian culture. He calls it stagnation, like the reason why the Assyrian culture stagnated. And one of his primary things was that he uh, he thought that the Assyrian clerics, were ignorant and kept the people in ignorance. And I think this was I think he was seen by some Assyrians as a champion for science, for enlightenment, and for kind of moving away from sort of a dark ages that a lot of the clerics were still trying to keep people in.
And he was an outspoken man, and he was not afraid by anybody or intimidated by anybody either.
No, it seems that he was quite, yes, that way. He wasn't afraid to say what he thought.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that, engaging by the book and all the letters that were written, say that would be a fair argument. But and also, let's go back to they called him the torchbearer. Actually, that's what I wanted to talk
Right,
about. He was
right.
known as the torchbearer because of the impact that he had on the community. And
Hmm.
so, going back to the actual title of the book that we talked
Hmm.
about,
Yeah.
and then the title of the book is Bloodied but Unbowed, a
Hmm.
memoir of the Asher and Asher Louis Joseph family. Tell us about the title. How did that come about?
Okay, so the original title of the book, and again, I'll show it. It's in Armenian. The original title in Armenian is Ayno Jabida, and that the direct translation of that would be the bloody smile, which
Mm,
doesn't have the same connotation in English as it does in Armenian.
right.
I mean, a closer meaning would be like to say smiling through tears. And
Mhm.
that didn't sound quite right. And I have in the introduction to the book, I say how I came across a poem, and there's a phrase in there, bloody but unbowed. And then I was thinking of that, but then talking to Professor Donabed, he thought, no, bloodied but unbowed sounds better than bloody but unbowed. So it turned into bloodied
Mm,
but unbowed. And I think that comes closest to the Armenian title. So it's even though the smile isn't there anymore, I think the spirit of the title is more
mm.
like bloodied but unbound is closer than bloody smile, which doesn't really mean anything in English.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And who is the title referring to when it says bloodied and unbound?
Well, it would be my great grandmother. It could
Right.
be my grandmother. Really anybody who was touched
Yeah.
by
The
by it.
community.
Mhm.
It could be a group of people, so not necessary. So it's not necessarily speaking about great grandma Usher Louise.
No, I mean, I think there's a personal, but also universal in it
I
because,
see.
yeah, I mean, she personally went through this tragedy, but also so did 1.5 million other people.
Right. Okay. And three cultures. Yeah. So going back to the book again, so I wanted to point out in the back of the book, apart from the genealogy and the lineage of the whole family, there's a lot of detailed information there. There are also many photos. So how did those photos come about? Like there's a portion of the book that has a whole lot of photos. Tell us about the photos. Where are these? How did you come about these photos? Where are they preserved, etc.?
Okay, so many of the photos were in my uncle John's possession. He's the uncle who wanted the book translated in the first place. So, they were my grandmother's photos. They were Alice Nazarian's photos that
Mm-hmm.
he had basically inherited or he had in his possession. So many of them came from him. Several came from some other cousins of my uncle. So various family members, yeah, sent them. They weren't in one place.
Oh, I see. So everybody just kind of came together and you collated the photos that the family members had.
Right, yeah, and I was, sometimes quite surprised that there was such a photo because I'd never seen it before. I
Mm.
mean, some of the photos I had seen growing up, but many of them I didn't know existed. So that was quite interesting. I
Yeah,
mean,
that would have
for
been
one thing, like in the Armenian edition, there is no photo
oh,
of my great grandmother. There is only a drawing. Let me show it.
yes, please.
Yeah, so there's only a drawing.
Mm.
So I had
Yes.
always just assumed there were no photos of her.
Right. There is
But
that
it,
picture is also in this book.
but it turned out, yeah, there were photos. And in fact, the cover
Yeah.
photo of the book,
Mm.
yeah, was a surprise find for me.
Yeah.
And I,
So,
the reason I used that photo was because, it shows she's in the middle. My great grandmother is in the middle, and she has her 5 children with her. The one that's missing is the one who had escaped to Armenia, and of course her husband is gone. So
right.
yeah, so I thought it was a good photo.
Yeah, beautiful photo. It seems like a formal portrait, but we can post
Right.
that on the website as well. So, looking at this book, is there anything else you would like to say about the book that we did not cover, Arda?
Yeah, I would like to talk about what for me, what was like the most moving discovery was that in the archives, the Modern Assyrian Research Archives, was a publication that was in Armenian, but it was an Assyrian publication. But as you know, many Assyrians in that era actually spoke Armenian and wrote in Armenian. So there was a publication that had in it 2 letters that my great grandmother had written, and the family was not aware of these letters. So the first one particularly was very moving because it described how Ashur Yusuf came to be arrested, my great grandmother's attempts to release him from jail. All of course came to no avail, how he was taken away to be killed. That was a very moving discovery for me, and we did include that in the book as well as the second
Yes.
letter. Mhm. Yeah, and
Yes.
that's something that we wouldn't have known about at all, if not for the introduction to Tomas at the Modern Assyrian Research Archive.
Yeah, well, that's
Yeah.
wonderful that you were able to get in touch with him and find all the treasures
Yes.
that your family had been missing or hoping to have a piece of, and then it did come back full circle. That's wonderful. So thank you for your time, Arda. I really do appreciate
Thank
that
you.
you were able to talk about your family story through the book Bloodied and but Unbowed, a memoir of Ashur and Ashur Louis Yosef family, written by Alice Nazarian, which was your grandmother. So
Correct.
tell us, Arda, if someone wanted to get a copy of this book, where could they do that or how?
Okay, so it turned out that this gentleman I've mentioned, Tomas, who runs the Modern Assyrian Research Archive, he also is a publisher, and his publishing company is called Nineveh Press, and so it's www.ninevehpress.com, and so that would be the place to order the book from.
Once again, thank you so much for your time. I
My
enjoyed
pleasure.
chatting with you and getting
Likewise.
to know you and your family and their story. Thank you so much, Arda.
Thank you.
Thank you. And once again, to our viewers, we want to say thank you. Thank you to AGN, the Assyrian Global Network, and Nabi Fry Fund for Culture, which sponsors our book club once a month. Thank you. Basi Maraba.